Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 474th New Social Environment. I'm Anya, the events assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and the privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Joan Semmel and Amelia Jones. We're thrilled to have Phong H here to close today's program with a poetry reading. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that Black Lives Matter, and that here in New York, we are on Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions, which I will post shortly. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Artist Joan Semmel began her painting career in the 1960s while living in Madrid as an abstract expressionist, exhibiting in Spain and South America. Returning to New York in 1970, she moved to figuration in response to pornography and concerns around representation of women in the culture. Her work has been widely exhibited and is in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art, New York, Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, the Tate, London, and many others. Art historian, critic, and curator Amelia Jones is the Robert A. Day Professor and Vice Dean of Academics and Research in Roski School of Art and Design at USC. Amelia is the curator of the critically acclaimed exhibition Sexual Politics, Judy Chicago's Dinner Party in Feminist Art History at the Hammer Museum, and most recently, Queer Communion, Ron Athey at Participant Incorporated New York and ICA Los Angeles. Recent publications include In Between Subjects, A Critical Genealogy of Queer Performance, and the anthology Otherwise, Imagining Queer Feminist Art Histories. So without further ado, please, Amelia and Joan, take it away.
Okay. Hello, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm going to start sharing my screen so everyone can see some of Joan's work while we talk. So I'm just going to say right off how honored I am to be here with Joan Semmel, an artist whose work I've obsessed over and admired for many, many years. It's like going on decades now, and I've taught the work so many times. So I was really thrilled when Jody Throckmorton invited me to contribute an essay to the catalog for the show Skin in the Game. So I'm going to get the conversation going by asking some questions, Joan, about your earliest work, as we discussed, your experience as an artist, your turn to painting. Then I'm going to weave in more complex questions about the relationship of your work to specific experiences you've had, and of course, to the world. To that end, these questions are all oriented towards understanding how your methods and subject matter produce images that interact with us. Your work for me activates what painting can do to produce different ways of seeing and thus different ways of thinking that shift the position of certain bodies in the social sphere. This speaks to how their power is both political and aesthetic, and that's what I address in the catalog. And so, yeah, we'll circle around that here. So first question is, what's it been like? How is it to have this major retrospective of your work up at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts?
Well, it's absolutely wonderful. I mean, I've been thrilled to see the exhibition. It's beautifully hung and beautifully thought through. So I much appreciate having it. And it's also been a thrill for me to see a lot of the early works, which I haven't seen for many, many years because they're in different collections. So all in all, it's been a wonderful experience.
Yeah, I wanted to show the work for which the show is entitled, because we're going to be crossing through a lot of themes that in some ways are kind of encapsulated in this incredible painting, which I haven't seen personally, but I imagine being in the room and being enveloped by this vast field. And some of your signature techniques and methods are here, with the close-up of your body being viewed as if we're you and we're looking down on it. And the use of color, where you're in some ways denaturalizing some of the views of the body. So all of these things I'm hoping we'll get into a bit more, but let's go back in time and talk a little bit about you as a younger person being in Spain, which I didn't know at all until I read the catalog. So do you want to just talk a little bit about this abstract work? And
Well, I think the abstract work is hardly known in this country, but was exhibited widely in Spain. And I lived there for almost 8 years. And during that time, I was working and showing professionally in major galleries there and in shows in South America. So this work went through a whole period of development also, because it was a period of almost 10 years of work and of the abstract work maturing to this particular point. The exhibition shows only 2 of those pieces, but we had to deal with the limitations of what one space could do. So that's what was chosen. And I think that some of the early abstraction was probably influenced somewhat by Spanish work at the time, which came really out of European surrealism. And so the kind of broad expressive gesture that I started out with as an abstract expressionist gradually closed into a more structured kind of abstraction. And it was from there that I then moved back to the States, and getting back to the States brought me into a whole different environment, different time of my life. And from there, I moved into representation again.
yeah, but the amazing thing about your painting is the way it's always kind of toggling between representation and abstraction. So it's great to see these earlier examples. What's it like for you to really spend time with these really early paintings?
Well, I still love them. I mean, I was very involved in them. And I was a passionate abstractionist. I went to school at a time when doing anything representational was considered old-fashioned and academic. And so to be on the cusp of what was contemporary at the time, one felt one had to be doing abstraction.
Yeah. And there was very interesting information in the catalog that I hadn't thought about, but that, you know, you were in a country that was still under Franco's regime, and women were, you know, second-class citizens, to say the least. And so that really, just living in that environment, you talk about how it raised your consciousness, so that when you came back to the States and you were in New York and the nascent feminist art movement was getting going, you kind of just stepped right into it.
I think that what happened for me in Spain was that all of my feelings about not having access to the broader culture as a young woman in America were clarified, because in Spain, it was so much more rigid. Women couldn't have their own bank accounts. I mean, they had them, but their husbands had access to them. You could not take a child out of the country without your husband's permission. You could not lease an apartment without the signature of either your father or your husband. A woman herself could not do that. So these things made it very clear that structurally the woman was limited into how she could function. Whereas in this country, it wasn't quite that obvious. But I had always felt as a young woman that I wanted to do things. I wanted to change the world. I wanted to make my mark on the world, not so much as making my mark, but as making the world a better place. And I was always told by my father, who adored me and whom I loved very much, I couldn't do that. I was a woman. The only thing I could do as a woman is have babies. And that's what I was told over and over again. And when I went to Spain, of course, I see that in a much clearer way, as not that I was the person who was neurotic because I wanted to break down some of those limitations, but that the social structure was limiting and politically determined what people could do, and that had to be changed. So it was a kind of revelation for me. So when I came back to this country, and I came back at a time just at the stirrings of the whole women's movement, the second wave was heating up. It was just a wonderful liberation for me.
Yeah, such an amazing story. And one more question relating to that moment is how you had, what gave you the conviction to stick with painting? Because as you said, you know, even painting itself was being questioned by a lot of the artists of your generation in New York. What gave you that conviction? And, you know, maybe you could also talk about how, as a woman artist, you feel that painting gives you a certain kind of agency that you wouldn't have with other media.
Well, I think the first thing is love. I loved paint. I mean, it was something that it was always my pleasure and my joy. And I wasn't willing to give up love, not for anything. So I just continued to do it despite all of the, I felt it was another restriction that I wasn't permitted to do that. And I was trying to break down restrictions, not put on more restrictions. So I just continued to paint because that's where I felt comfortable and it's what I love to do. And intellectually, I understood, respected, and supported those artists who were doing other things. Because what was interesting for me was what the content was of the work, where the work was centered, what was the incentive to the work. All of those elements were what made art interesting to me. So it wasn't which technique was being used and which field an artist chose to move in. I wanted everyone to have the freedom to be able to move in whatever field they wished. And painting was mine, and I wasn't about to give it up.
I love that. You're in love with painting. And with that, I'm going to turn to a drawing, which is part of your painting. And this incredible, I mean, from my point of view, the moxie of turning, you know, to figuration in a period, as you said, where that was just not done, especially by younger artists who had ambitious aesthetic ideas. And not only did you turn to naked bodies, but bodies having sex, and then to your own body, all of these things being kind of, I mean, the way that you depict your own body really is just beyond the canon. Nobody else had really done that before. So can you talk more about that shift? And again, is it just that you insisted on doing what you wanted to do, or were there other political motivations in this courage that you showed with this work?
Well, I think that it was, I always worked, liked to draw from the figure. I did that at school, and my abstract paintings, I always started with a figure drawing, and then I would break it apart. So I came back to trying to move from abstraction into a more politically centered kind of image by going back to those figure drawings. But instead of trying to break it apart, trying to bring the figure into a context where it had some relevance for me at the time. And I was a young woman who was sexually involved and interested. And sexuality, when I was in Spain, was always something as seen as a liberation because it was so repressed there. And that kind of liberation, when I came back to New York, was very confusing because what I saw in a world that was supposedly sexually liberated was a kind of sexual commercialization where the women still were objectified and used as a kind of fetish object rather than as a person with her own agency. So I moved from those physical drawings just from the model into a more active situation where what I felt was important was for women to have their own sense of sexual agency and not to always be in service of whatever the male person needed in that situation. So I had the opportunity. Don't forget, New York at that time was after the sexual revolution. It was before AIDS. It was a time of high experimentation. There were swinging parties and all kinds of things going on. And I found, I had a friend who suggested that if I wanted to do that kind of work, I needed to draw from it to be able to make it feel right. And so there was a person who was a bit of an exhibitionist and would come and with a woman who was eager to do that also. And we would have several artists and would work from them while they did their thing. And it was very interesting. I worked with it with magic marker that was fast so that I could be able to move quickly and move around the setup so that I was able to get different kinds of views. And my interest in doing that was I wanted to be able to do a work that would be interesting for women sexually, so that women could also participate in that whole revolution from their own sense of what they desired rather than what men told them they should want. And that was the impetus for the work. And so I have many, many of these kinds of drawings. There were many sessions, and the first paintings came from the drawings. So they were done with a kind of expressive gesture. And you could see the relationship between the painting here and the original drawings that were made from them. It was an important kind of transition for me. I wanted to go back to the content in the work, but I didn't want it to be academic. I wanted to find how could I make it current, contemporary, and carry the message that I was looking for in terms of what liberation would be for a woman.
Well, you definitely succeeded in exploding the academic, the idea of proper content.
Oh, they were never called academic.
Yeah. No, not at all. And one of the incredibly interesting things is your choice of color. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I still thought abstractly, so that was the reason the paintings were so strong. Because even though I was working with the idea of representation to a certain degree, it was still about the academic structure. And that was what interested me. How was I able to use the abstraction and make it alive still in terms of representing what I was interested in communicating. And that was the whole impetus for my use of color, for my use of form. I always was trying to make abstraction serve representation rather than deny representation and break down representation. I think that the history of art was a process of trying to break down what the Renaissance gave us by taking it apart piece by piece. And I wanted to put it back together again, but not in the same pieces.
Wow. That's a great moment to move to these amazing paintings, which I completely project into this image. And I always imagined that was you and you were somehow like, you know, depicting your own post-coital moment. Well, that's just me, right? But that's what you're offering to us as viewers, as whether male, female identified, what have you. You put us in the position of those two bodies.
Well, I think that the first paintings that I did, which you just saw, worked from a gestural point of view, but I gradually moved into photographs, taking photographs of those people and then into photographs of myself. The reason to use myself was not so much to represent me, but I wanted to move the painting out into the space of the viewer rather than pull the viewer into the space of the painting. And so one of the things that I did was the use of the camera in a way that it seemed as if the viewer was in the painting, was the head, so to speak, of the painting that was left out.
Yeah, it's very profound, and it does something also politically, because it makes a really powerful point about, you know, what a woman is allowed to see and experience, and so that agency is really powerful.
Well, I wanted it to be very clear that the painting was made by a woman, that I was the artist, and that I was also the woman. Mm-hmm. So that, because we were told, of course, that back then, and still sometimes today, that of course, a woman can't paint, right? I mean, women can't do that. And so I was demanding and insisting that the artist here was a woman and also was the body. And then I was also trying to speak to, again, to the feelings of what a woman feels about her own body is different than as she is portrayed by somebody else. And so I wanted, for instance, in this particular painting, where you see a man and a woman lying next to each other, one of the things that I felt about how women felt about themselves sexually was always to be in service of the needs of the man. And how does one achieve intimacy and still have autonomy? And so I called this painting Intimacy, Autonomy. And I think that it speaks for itself, I hope.
Well, you've completely justified my projection, so thank you. That's exactly how I always viewed it. And this is right about the moment where feminists in the UK were theorizing the male gaze. And this is just the most brilliant, like totally opposite way of thinking about it, which is just to assert the female gaze.
Right. I mean, that's what I worked for. And we didn't have the words yet when I was doing it. I mean, I had never heard male gaze or female gaze, but I was completely what I was involved with. And I remember at the time, there was an art critic, I guess, John Berger,
Yeah,
John, who wrote Ways of Seeing,
yeah,
spoke of how men were seen as to what they do, and women men were judged by what they do, what they did in the world, and women were judged by how they looked in the world.
yeah.
Right. And so that encapsulated in certain ways the limitations that were put upon us. And I was trying to break that down.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. The next image is a perfect segue again, because here the intimacy is really with yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I moved finally, I moved from the sexuality to the self-image, which I felt also that women were determined in life by their bodies, what they could do, had to do with their physical attributes in terms of how they looked, but not only how they looked, but how they performed, mother, child, that whole kind of biological determination. And that in order for us to move ahead, we had to first come to terms with our bodies, accept our own bodies, what they were, what they could do for us, that both pain and pleasure came from the body. And how do we resolve those issues?
wow. Yeah, and we chatted a bit last week, and you talked about how important it is that these paintings are of their time and place, that all of them relate to obviously where you were at the time and how you were thinking, but also to these bigger issues. Does that, when you look at these now, does it put you back in that political and social moment?
Well, it does, and it's kind of interesting because obviously I moved ahead, I kept moving, but I thought at the time that they were paintings of the moment, of the issues of the moment. But of course, I think that they still resonate today. And that surprises me sometimes, that young people write to me and tell me how important they are for them. So those issues are not, maybe they're not just issues of the moment, but they're just the human confrontation with with a person's space and place in the world, that both men and women have to deal with some of those issues, maybe all the time.
I mean, there's such kind of contemplative versions of what now is ubiquitous and almost aggressive, which is the self-imaging culture in social media. So I enjoy teaching these to Zoomers because, they don't think, nobody when they're 20 years old thinks there's a history, right? And so they don't realize there's a whole history that goes way back actually to the early modern period in European history of self-imaging. And that it goes through a practice like this where you're specifically breaking from that early modern tradition of the artist looking in a mirror and depicting usually himself in that kind of way. And yet here, so the title to me kind of references that, me without mirrors, that, you know, you're just looking at yourself. And yet, of course, the paradox is this is a representation. So,
well, of course, and I was very determined that that the images that I would give would be, quote, through my own eyes, in the sense that it wouldn't be a reflected image, and also that we were always, from the word go, looking in the mirror at ourselves. You were always looking to find yourself in that mirror. And I wanted to stop looking at the reflected image and looking at the sensual image of how one experienced the body, rather than just how one sees it in the mirror. So there was kind of the underlying motives in the work. And then later on, once I had done many of these kinds of works, I started moving to, well, how do I now extend this? And what does looking in the mirror mean? And how is that somewhat narcissistic, that constant thing? And how is that narcissism part of our culture? So I extended all of that and moved to some images in the mirror, and of myself, taking myself in the mirror, but of also other people in the mirror, and in an environment like the locker room, which is all mirrors. And what does that prevalence of that mean in this culture where everybody is always looking in the mirror?
yeah, amazing. We're going to get to that. I'm going to give teasers for the viewers.
Yeah.
But I wanted to, just one more thing about this moment, which is carried through your whole career, which is the way that you talk about the experienced body. And painting is a bodily mode of creativity. And so there is a way in which your insistence on painting, for me, is about your love of painting, but also it enacts this kind of materiality of the body through the gesture. And maybe you could comment on that.
It does. And I think for me, one of the reasons I like painting is because it engages you totally. I mean, you don't sit still when you paint. You walk back and forth. You're touching things. You're using your hands. You're using your eyes. You're using your head. You're totally engaged in every sense of the word. And that's part of the joy of it. Sitting at a computer and making whatever is very different. And I wanted that total engagement. And I think that there's a carnal kind of sensibility. And I like that carnality of the flesh in connection with the carnality of the paint.
Oh, that's beautiful. And now, kind of a tangent, is this moment where, as I understand, you were specifically responding. Right. You were angry about something. And
I was pretty angry. Well, yeah. I think there was a show at the gallery that I was with at the time that was a political show. It was 1976, I think, was the bicentennial, and it was called A Patriotic Show. And the dealer wanted it to, it was all artists who were politically involved. And I was politically involved. I was a feminist. And he said, well, how could he use one of my paintings? He'd have to stand up and give a lecture about the nude, why it was political. And I said, okay, I'll paint you a diagram. And so what I did was this piece where I used the centerpiece of it. It's 3 panels. The centerpiece is one of my self-images, and I did a parody of a de Kooning painting on the right. I glued on a nursing nipple on the glue on the breast, and with glue on the breast, and on the image on the left, there were feathers glued in on the Playboy image. And I called it Mythologies in Me. So I took an image from the popular culture and an image from high culture as to how women were perceived and projected into the culture that we all lived in, and then put that as a contrast to next to the painting of myself and how I wanted to be perceived and understood in the culture. And I called it Mythologies in Me.
Does this painting feel odd to you because it is so different? I love the subtlety of the politics of all the work, and then this one is just like gonna be political.
That's right out there, that's what.
Yeah.
But it was interesting because it also gave me a way. I had experimented in with other ways, but I always, again, the abstraction together with realism. How does one do that? And how could I make this painting hold together, right? When I had an abstract expressionist and a popular kind of advertising image, and then painting the way I was painting. And how does that all work together? And can one make it work together? So that was, for me, the most interesting part of painting, how to make that all hold together.
So did he include it in his political art show?
Yes, he did. He did.
Good.
It was included. Absolutely.
Objective achieved.
Yes.
Yeah, so now there is this a little bit of a, it seems like a tangent, but it's not, of course, because you just explained the mirrors and then the move away from your own, well, sometimes your own body, but also others' bodies and mirrors and these spaces of, I think, again, you're way ahead of your time to see the gym as a space of narcissism, which that definitely is, but that's something that most of us didn't really think about until more recently when it's been represented more that way. So maybe you could talk about
well, I think like the painting that's up there says it in a certain way, where I took pictures in the gymnasium, and from the gymnasium, then I also moved to the locker room. So in the gymnasium, of course, the figures were dressed; they weren't naked, but there they were. It was amazing because everybody was looking at themselves in the mirror. You know, there wasn't hardly any communication between people. It was just total fascination. And in this particular piece, I call it abeyance. And it's the figure with the back to us, looking into the mirror and bowing down. And it just, of course, it was exercising, but it made my point, I felt. That kind of a worship of the mirror image, right?
And how did that connect to like that point in your life or what you saw going on in the culture? Because the 80s really were, you know, in many ways, kind of the rise of this self-centeredism that gave birth to social media.
Well, you know, I do think that, you know, like, and that's how come I was, you know, so far ahead of doing, I think the fact that I lived outside of the country for several years and then came back to the country. So there's like a sharp change where a lot of things that people moved into without being so aware of what they were a shock to me. And so I was able to think about what they meant and why they were happening, why things were happening that way. But in respect to the images in the locker room pieces, I, again, a lot of my work is intuitive rather than intellectually predetermined, so that things happen in the work that I see and suddenly that stimulates the idea rather than me having an idea and then illustrating it, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that's part of the strength of the paintings, because they give me the idea, but they also give the audience, the viewer, the ideas that I'm trying to communicate, and hopefully that other people see what I see, or that other people may see something different, which is okay too, because that reveals other things that I'm not aware of, you know.
Yeah, I really experience your work that way, as giving us a space, as kind of, they're generous in that you're presenting an opportunity for us to connect with them, whether it's kind of as you when we're looking down at your body, or in this space where you're definitely the observer.
Well, yeah, but don't forget also that these kind of pictures, like the locker room, I take lots and lots and lots of photos and then select out.
Yeah.
So in that selection process, of course, is my editing process of what starts poking the images towards the ideas that are interesting to me. And so in this particular one, for instance, preoccupation of women with their weight, always, right? And the older person trying to look younger, right? Always there. So, and that's where older bodies cropped up.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought to go looking for older bodies, but there I was in the locker room, and there were people of all different sizes and shapes. So that presented itself to me and was perfect for the kind of thing that I was trying to do.
Were you thinking consciously of yourself as an aging body, or was it?
I wasn't. I really wasn't. I mean, of course, once I saw all of that, and as I was growing older, I realized that I had some of those same quote problems, and so it was logical then for me to understand that as I continued to work as I got older with my own body, that aging would be part of what the work was about.
Yeah, definitely. But before we move to that, there's this gorgeous group of paintings where you're really deliberately doubling through the tension between abstraction and realism.
These paintings came right in between the realist paintings and the sexual paintings, right? They came right around the same time. And for instance, the Mythologies in Me piece stimulated some of that. Part of what happened here was I started using color Xerox instead of photographs as information for the images. So the technology at that point offered itself to me, that color Xerox became a possibility. And I would make preparatory drawings for these with the Xerox a collage piece with the Xerox that I started from, and then open it out into a more expressionist drawing. And
that's like this, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So that was the process that those paintings came about. And again, the reason for it was I hated having to lose the freedom of the expressionist paintings that I had of using color and paint in a much more loose and dynamic way. But yet I wanted to be able to have the image resonate with the message that I was trying to send about the body. So I put the two things together and used what I called an echoing image, the image of the body from the photo, from the Xerox, and then moving it to the element of the paint. So there's one inside of the other. So it's almost as if I felt like I was still connecting to the culture, which was abstraction, but with my own sense of myself as a female body.
Yeah, amazing.
I don't know if that's what communicates there, but that was my intent. And I had about 8 or 10 pictures like that from that group. Yeah.
Yeah, they're pretty gorgeous, even as reproductions, but I have to see the paintings.
Well, they're a very large scale.
Yeah.
Because in order to maintain the vigor and all, first of all, I always like to work large and to get both images in. So this is quite large. It's about 10 feet, something like that. Yeah, I don't remember exactly, but it's quite large. And it's one of the major pieces in the exhibition in PAFA.
Right. I mean, so it's so interesting that in that work, you're doing the doubling through just the composition and the kind of technique. And then in other works a little later, you're really explicitly doubling through mirrors and cameras. And
here's one that it's both the mirror and the camera, you know. So again, I'm insisting that I'm the artist, the female artist, by showing myself holding the camera. And yet I'm showing also how one's sense of self is constructed, not by just experiencing oneself, but by looking in the mirror, which is doubled also, and also using the camera. So that all of these elements are the ways that our identity, ourselves, we understand ourselves through these refracted images that are not real. They're not absolute, they're not flesh. They're just refracted images.
I mean, and again, the paradox is the painting's not you either, but because it's painting, it carries this like physical energy of the act of painting. So I just love that you go in that direction.
So what I'm doing is I'm putting all of those things together to try to compress the complexity of how one's identity is formed, right?
Yeah.
And then once that an identity is formed that way, how it is influenced by all those external forces to become oneself as one experiences oneself.
Yeah, you're a phenomenologist.
I don't know.
And then this series is amazing because you made the decision to paint over other paintings.
Well, by that time, I mean, life was not that easy in terms of getting my work seen out there, and nobody would look at the sexual pieces. They were still considered not appropriate, so to speak, to be having sexual paintings like that. So I thought, well, nobody will want to see these anymore. So I'll just use them as a basis for some overlays of the images that I was working with at the time, which were the ones with the camera and the ones in the locker room. And so I used some of the drawings that from those photographs and threw them over some of the sexual pieces. And I called them overlays. Right?
Yeah, they, again,
luckily I didn't destroy all of the sexual pieces, and I just did a few of them so that I still had enough left to have that work still alive. Yeah.
And the quality of paint is so interesting because you're allowing this almost diaphanous, this very thin wash of paint And then, but there's also that area where it just, this density where I'm assuming it's you taking a picture.
Yeah. Well, I always like the qualities of paint, to be able to put the different qualities of paint together in the same painting. So that I like to be able to use a thin wash, and then I like to be able to use a heavy loaded brush, so that all of these things play off of each other. And of course, I've discovered in the process of painting that some of the illusionistic ways that form has been built and space has been built are not necessary, that one could, by using the weight of the paint itself, makes an image move forward or back. And the thinness of a paint makes a transparency. That means that there's different levels and layers of paint that make different levels of space that one can enter into the painting. So all of those things were a kind of exploration of ways of painting that also were exploration of ways of thinking, of ways of memory, of how images overlap each other in our memory, and how time expands in our memories, so that we live not only in the moment, but we live both in the moment, in our projections of the future, and in remembrances of the past, all together at the same time.
That's really profound, John. And as we've got about 10 minutes left, so I want to make sure we have time to move to the images of you aging or of your current body. This is one of those where you're doing the doubling with the mirror. And I'm just particularly fond of your thigh. And it's just like one of those beautiful painterly moments.
Well, this one, I have a whole series like this where I've painted both the camera and the mirror, and myself, of course, and then the mannequin. So did a whole series of mannequins. And in this one, I included one of the mannequins with the self, because there was sort of a similar pose on the mannequin, and that the positioning that I took of the elbow and the way the legs bent and so on. And so then I was able to get into it, some of my theories, quote, about the way women are expected to be in the culture in terms of modeled into inhuman forms that are supposedly human, right?
Yeah, but what's so great about the contrast is the physicality and weight of your body is really highlighted with that contrast.
I really wanted the difference between what a real body is, right? Yeah. And what the mechanical aspects of those images are.
So that those really beautiful thoughts you were spinning out about memory and layering, and how that parallels kind of what you're doing with these canvases, really speaks, of course, to these more recent works. This one where you're disappearing, you're kind of melting into the picture plane.
Well, that has something to do with aging, I imagine, that we get disappeared very, very much. And so I think it was some of a commentary on that. And I liked what just could happen with the blurring. I'm always experimenting with what happens in different ways of painting, so that what happened in taking some of these pictures was I would sometimes use a timer and then move quickly to try to sit down in front of the camera before the shutter would go. And so I'd get some of these images that were somewhat blurred, and I liked what happened with that. And so this is just one of them. Yeah.
And but that sense of temporality and movement too, which actually goes back to the futurist painters who kind of,
Exactly, it does.
yeah, they had that method of just moving the body through space, which doesn't.
Yeah, here again, I'm moving it in a
Yeah.
different way. I'm using it much more, more like the futurists in a certain sense. But I was always interested, as I said, in taking the ways that art in the modernist period has taken apart illusionism and broken it down into cubism, impressionism, post-impressionism, and so on, and use all of those elements, not discard them, but use them to make them serve us today in other ways. Because of course, what we get with the computer also has service in terms of getting overlaps and so on that you could not get before. Yeah.
But the mere fact of your body being both the painter and the subject is also just inherently disruptive to that form of modernism, because they never would have paid attention to a woman in this way, or an older woman. Right. So it's quite radical just because of that tension, I think.
Well, it's radical because of that tension, but it also shows the body and myself in moments of transition, that one is never static, that there's always that kind of movement. And one is not always sad or happy or angry or peaceful, but there's always that kind of interlocking moment from moment to moment. And it's part of what makes us human. And when one's trying to represent a body or a person just at one particular moment, and that's the only moment that's shown, it's false.
Yeah.
It's not real. It couldn't be real.
Yeah. That's that old dilemma of representation. But even of human existence, as you pointed out, you're never static in a split second. You're always relating to your past and future.
Yeah. Yeah. And here is another way that I played with some of those same ideas, where again, and this one is another kind of overlay, where I'd have one image, the drawn image is usually seen as the undercoating, an under layer of a painting. And I put the drawn image on top of the painting so that the underlying image is the more flesh kind of image, and the linear image is on top of it. And again, it gives like two different moments and two different positions of the body.
Yeah, and this very beautiful.
This is a very large painting also. It's a diptych. It's in 2 panels. And it's again, I played around with some of the idea, I call it, it's the couch diptych. I usually don't have any kind of furniture or anything in the painting. It's usually just the body, but I started using some structures within with the body. It's a form of variety and another kind of structure for it. And so the couch gave me the kind of positioning of the body in the traditional, almost sexual kind of provocative mode, but of course with the older body and what that is and how that is. And then in a more defensive position where the body is almost sexless and just becomes the kind of defending structure. So I was playing around with some of the aging connections to the body. And again, with the more realistic and less realistic aspects of it.
Yeah, I mean, you have a very interesting relationship to us here, because you're kind of giving us yourself, but at the same time warding us off almost as viewers.
Right.
So maybe this can be the last moment before we move to the Q&A. And I just, again, wanted, this is a detail of a recent painting, that couch diptych, and then the very early 1968. And I just wanted to say again that for me, you're at the top of the list among artists who present images that are actually politically meaningful and powerful, but through completely aesthetic means. That, in other words, you never became a conceptual artist, as you say, that you were absolutely determined to continue to paint and to use paint for the way in which it actualized your body, both in terms of the content and the process. And I just think it's so powerful that the way that you use paint not only represents the body because of the subject matter, but that it actualizes this energy, it indexes the power of you as a woman artist, and even someone who has persisted through these decades where, as you said, there were periods where nobody cared and periods where all of a sudden everybody was interested in your work again. Yeah, so I just honor your persistence and your vision and your skill. And maybe, yeah, if you have anything more to say about that and the intimacies that you've created for us as viewers.
Well, all I could say is I really appreciate so much that you have been able and willing to enter into this with me. You know, the work, I always worked out of my own compulsion, I must say. It never had to do with ambition. It had to do with compulsion more than anything else. It was the place where I had pleasure. And I am very pleased that it has received the kind of attention that people like yourself have given it. So it's for me, as I told you when we spoke, I always would define myself as an artist first. And it's why that is, I really don't know, but that's who I am.
That's a great note to end on, and maybe turn to the Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Joan and Amelia, for this wonderful conversation. This has been so lovely to listen to. And we have a number of audience questions. Our first one will come from Clarity Haynes.
Oh,
and you can turn on your microphone.
Hello, this is
hi.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for such an incredible conversation. And congratulations, Joan, on your just absolutely magnificent show. And I encourage everyone to go see it. I have a two-part question with a part for both of you, if that's okay. For Joan, I'm curious about how much attention has been brought to your portrayal of male bodies. It strikes me that you portray the bodies of men in such a tender, tactile way that goes against popular conceptions of the idealized masculine body. And I'm wondering how the reception of that aspect of your work has been over the years. And for Amelia, when writing in the catalog in your amazing essay, which I just adored, about the mutual materialities of flesh and paint, especially when considering the recent work of the aging body, at one point you wrote something like, I want to touch the body depicted. And I do feel that these depictions of the aging bodies are so evocative and tactile, and that they are very inviting, and that these bodies that are being depicted are sort of insisting on their own sensuality, and that there's an erotics there. And I would love to hear more about that, and whether you, Amelia, think that is part of the way in which Semmel's work challenges or kills the patriarchy?
Do you want to go first?
No, you should go first. That's a beautiful question about how you represent men.
I don't think that anyone has really ever talked about the way I represent men. And I would just like to say that I think that some of the problems that I've spoken about, men have similar, not similar, but different kinds of problems with aspects of themselves also. And for me, when I dealt with sexuality, one of the big things I always felt was that women respond to touch. So I wanted in some way to be able to show that one of the things that's stimulating for women erotically is touch. And that would have some connection to how I think I portray men's bodies, because I don't think women look at men quite in the way that men look at women, in the sense that one tends to be stimulated by the way a man touches you or the way you touch him, rather than by looking at how his muscles are formed, and how buff he is. And so it's just a very different way of approaching what a sexual relationship is.
I thought of that question makes me think about Elaine de Koonig's basketball players, which are incredible, actually, as homages to, in this case, kind of very athletic male bodies. And I've never seen anyone really talk about them, or someone should do a show of feminist representations of men. I think it's been done, but
it has been.
It'd be great to include those. As for your question to me, Clarity, yes, absolutely. And I think amazingly enough, Joan actually kind of said it probably better than I could, that it is in fact what she was reaching for even in as early as 1970, was this way in which, by being the artist and using the paint and depicting, in some cases, herself, there's an agency there just in and of itself, but also you're creating images of women's bodies or men's bodies from a heterosexual female point of view, which is very powerful. So definitely within the rigid binaries of patriarchal heteronormative culture, yes, by definition, I think both the content and the incredible use of paint and the way it's used to evoke and remind us of the painting body does make a powerful intervention into kind of conventional ideas, what women should be doing, etc.
Thank you, Clarity, for those excellent questions. Our next question will be coming from Laura B. Fishman, and you can turn on your microphone.
Hi, first, I just want to thank you both. I've so enjoyed this conversation. What a privilege to get to listen to you. It's been touched on a bit in the conversation, but I was curious, we ascribe a sense of older body to these images, these more recent paintings that Joan is painting. And I'm curious, Joan, do you look at them as paintings of older bodies or of your body or a body? And is it just that we're perhaps unused to seeing aging bodies and nude female aging bodies, and that maybe that is changing the conversation? And I know you're also talking about wrestling with ideas of youth and things like that, but I'm curious sort of where the line or interplay of those things are. Thank you so much.
Well, I think at this point, I am not so involved with whose body and which body and why, as I am with how it sits on canvas, what it can give me is another opening up the space and playing with the color. So it becomes almost pure painting for me, where I'm just using the tools that I always use to get into the painting. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist as an aged body, right? But I don't think of it that way. I frankly don't think of myself as an aged person. I think of myself as a person. So it's that kind of lack of specificity that perhaps can come from pure specificity, if you can say that word. In other words, the more specific one becomes, in a certain sense, the less specific it is in another sense. It becomes just a human being.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Laura. That was a wonderful question. Our next question will come from Aviva Ramani. You can turn on your microphone.
Thank you. This has been such a pleasure just to look at these incredibly lush, gorgeous images. And thank you, Amelia, for interesting questions. And Joan, I really appreciate your generous attitude. I'm curious about some of your collegial relationships, specifically Carolee Schneemann, because even though you obviously worked, Carolee, in such extremely different modes, so many of the concerns seem to overlap. And I wondered whether you guys were friends, and if so, whether you felt that you supported each other or what that might have been.
Oh yeah, we were friends, but we weren't friends before. I mean, in other words, we of course got to know each other just because of the interactions within the art world. And we became friends and shared, so certain situations, social situations and so on. But I don't know that we influenced each other, except that we were awfully glad that we each existed, right? Because we echoed each other in so many ways. And in many different ways. And it was part of the zeitgeist of that time, also of women like us who got out there and were activists. And that was part of our relationship with each other as co-activists, in this very resistant world.
I just want to throw in that Carolee was adamant always that she was a painter. And I love that, like, her way of being a painter obviously took very different form from your way of being a painter.
Yeah. Well, she always felt herself as a painter because she hated being called a dancer, right? Yeah. Because that just made her into another female performer up there, of a beautiful woman getting up there and doing things with her body. And as a painter, she felt more in control of the culture, so to speak. I'm just, projecting my own view on her, but I think that as a painter, she was much less influential than she was as a performer.
Yeah. I think that's right.
Thank you, Aviva. Thank you, Joan, for those insights. Our final question will come from Susan B. And you can turn on your microphone now.
Oh, hi. I didn't so much have a question. I just think this has been a most amazing talk. It's really been very insightful from Amelia and from Joan, both of whom I've known for many years. And I saw the show at PAFA, which I think is extraordinary. And I hope everybody who manages to get to Philadelphia, of course, I'm in Brooklyn, manages to see this show, because the paintings have so much force when you see them in person. And the scale of the paintings is just huge. And when you meet Joan, who I've met, she's not so big. And I'm also a smallish,
Luckily.
small Jewish women painting these gigantic paintings. It's very, and also that I think that there's a frankness and an honesty that's very important to me in how you talk about the work. It's also analytical, but it's also, there's something very direct. I can't put my finger on it, but a lot of times when painters talk about their work, they get into kind of high flow theories, and what's present in the work and isn't present when you talk about the work is also this kind of insightful, direct, analytical force, but also an attention to color and brush strokes and all the joy that's in painting itself. So I think, and feminism, of course, and all of the people that surrounded you in the feminist context. But I just think bringing all of those things, plus the heterosexual view of men, which I, as a heterosexual, artist, that little group, I like to see that, and I really appreciate it. So I guess this isn't so much a question as a thank you. Thank you for the work, which I think has a lot of implications for other artists and also for the viewers who get a lot out of seeing how you approach the body and how you make it your own, and the use of imagination in terms of the color. So that's kind of a lengthy comment, but it's really a thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for knowing.
So beautiful. Thank you, Susan, for your comments and for your thanks. And thank you, Joan and Amelia, again, for this wonderful conversation, and to everyone for asking their questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions. I wish we could, but I appreciate all of your contributions in the chat and comments. At the Brooklyn Rail, we have a tradition of ending these community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome Phong H. to the stage. Artist, writer, and independent curator, Phong H. is publisher and artistic director of the Brooklyn Rail, the River Rail Editions, and Rail curatorial projects. From 2007 to 2010, he served as curatorial advisor at MoMA PS1. Phong, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Anya. Thank you, Amelia. Thank you, Joan. It's just fantastic. You both are so articulate about this complex issue. I like to read this poem just partly because it kind of reminds so much of both of you. Still I Rise, the famous poem by Maya Angelou. And then I read one that basically notes from both of you talking that I made it into a tiny poem right after. You might write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You might trot me with the very dirt, but still like dust, I rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I got oil wells pumping in my living room, just like moons and like suns, with the certainty of ties. Just like hope springing high, still I rise. Did you want to see me broken, bald head and lower eyes, shoulders falling like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard, 'cause I laugh like I got gold mines, digging in my own backyard. You might shoot me with your words. You might cut me with your eyes. You might kill me with your hatefulness, but still like air, I will rise. Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise? That a dance, I dance like got diamonds at the meeting of my thighs. Out of the hut of history's shame, I rise. Up from a path that rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Living behind nights of terror and fear, I rise into a daybreak that wondrously clear. I rise, bringing the gifts that my ancestor gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. And then this is basically notes I took. I'm sorry I missed the first half, was caught in the meeting, but it's for Joan and for you too, Amelia. Mythology in me. Temporality and movement through space, subtlety of politics, inherently disruptive materiality of the body, notion nipples, interlocking memory, diaphanous density. Yes, it is double tech of certain sinister ambience. It is the space of narcissism, selectively predetermined, dependent structure, sexless, insistent agent body, older body, locker room, purple diagonal, poking images, objective achieve, the place of pleasure, compulsion, echoing, carnality of the flesh. How do they hold it all together? Carnality of the paint is touch, erotically culture abstraction. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Phong, for those readings. And thank you again to Joan and Amelia. We'd also like to thank Clarity Haynes, Jody Throckmorton from the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and Nicole Caruso from Alexander Gray Associates for helping to make today's event possible. We encourage everyone to view our archive of these conversations on our YouTube channel. This will be uploaded there shortly. And you can join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Wes Lang and Andrew Woolbright. And we will conclude with a poetry reading by Sarah Rule. And you can now turn on your microphones to say thank you and goodbye. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Wonderful
Bye.
conversation.
Bye.
This is great.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you, everyone.
Everyone.
Congratulations, Joan.
Good job, you guys.
Thank you so much, Joan.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
See you.
Thank you for your time.
Done.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Martha. Hi, Andrew. Go see the show, okay?
Yes.
Please. Congratulations, Joan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Yes.
you. Thank you.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Much
Thank
love.
you. Thank you, Amelia.
Oh, thank you, John. Amazing. Hi, Martha.
Absolutely. Bye. Talk
Bye.
soon. Much love.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.